So you're a journalist, right? And you've been told very recently to look into a story having to do with the Pentagon moving a bunch of IP addresses literally 3 minutes into Joe Biden's administration, literally 3 minutes into after he got inaugurated. And you're told, listen, do what you have to do. You have the investigative resources. Do what you need to do in order to find out what's going on here. Why all of these IP addresses suddenly got moved to another company. You start looking into the metadata of a lot of the IP addresses, and you keep seeing the reoccurrence of the number 5150. And you think to yourself, does that not sound familiar? Does that not seem similar to certain alleged, frequential healing codes? Now, I know there are different ones, 51550, and there's different ones like this. But the point here, folks, is this. There's a massive difference between interpolation and extrapolation. And the reason why I bring this up is because when it comes to interpolation, we are interpreting the data as we see fit from what we have collected, and we are making conclusions based on the evidence within the context of our investigation. Extrapolation means that we're basically projecting different theories off into different areas that we can honestly say could be projected to be probable in many different ways. Now, before I do that, I just want to give a very, very special thank you, by the way, to all of you who have supported me this entire time for the last couple weeks that I've been off. A lot of people have asked, Dave, what happened to you? Are you okay? Let me just say, folks, there were a few things that happened that was completely out of my control, and there were other things that happened that affected me directly. I just want you to know that for those saying, Dave, have you gotten lazy or this or that? It's got nothing to do with that, folks. And I do want to say, if you're on Patreon, you'll know much more, you'll have much more knowledge of what happened and what have you. But anyways, let's jump into it. So first off, Project 5150, the refinery built to cover for NSA seances or sacrifices. Now, first off, we need to know what 5150 means. Now, putting the Pentagon IP address situation aside for just a second, folks, you're going to see how this comes full circle with the NSA and the tall whites and the grays. But if we take a look here at palmpartners.com, California Welfare and Institution Code, Section 5150, second paragraph. Section 5150 is a section in the California Welfare and Institutions Code which allows a qualified officer or clinician to involuntarily, against their will, by the way, folks, take a look at that, against their will, confine a person who is deemed to have a mental disorder that makes him or her a danger to themselves or others. All right. A 515 hold is very similar to a blank. Notice how there's a massive redaction right there. Instead of the traditional black bar, see how that's already part of the psychological warfare aspect of it. They don't use the black bars to black things out because they know that your subconscious associates that with CIA, FBI, NSA, DNI documents, you name it. So they blur it out in white. I know that sounds a little bit silly, but just bear with me. Now, we can talk about how there are different scenarios in general where people who, commit mass, very unfortunate events of violence, if you will, tend to generally be people with mental disorders. Now, what happens with the people that have those disorders were in fact given those disorders to justify something that had to be used on a much grander scale. So let's take a look right here at, again, arthub.com. Jacqueline Smith is one person who questioned whether she actually belonged on Earth as a young child. We recently spoke with Smith about hybrid children and how she has adapted and dealt with her heightened abilities. Now, end quote. Before I go on, this has to do directly, folks, with what the Pentagon is doing, and you'll see right after this. Now, let's take a look. Smith talks about her real origins and her DNA. She says she has the DNA of up to 7 alien races and describes herself as a blended soul or blended hybrid. All right. Her mother was taken while pregnant with her, and she remembers when she was injected with a cocktail of alien DNA, end quote. Now, this has to do with something called dendrochronology, and that is, according to Wikipedia, the scientific method of dating tree rings, being able to predate when tree rings occurred. Now, why is it that there were certain dummy companies from the CIA having to do with dendrochronological, tree dating, a predating of trees, if you will, or methods that generally have to do with something in the blockchain, in the virtual world. So why is something from real life nature being associated with software? Well, folks, I will tell you this. It has to do with the fact that when we look at how quantum physics, and quantum physicists have admitted publicly, by the way, that the more they study the actual confines of the internet and compare it to the study of the actual universe that we live in, the simulation, the matrix, whatever you want to call it, there are more and more stark differences. And the reason for this is because the NSA has been quietly working on something called Project Mannequin, which was given to them by the Zeta Reticuli. So let's take a look at Biblioteca plates. Project Mannequin was and is being run by the NSA from an underground facility in Peasmore, Berkshire in the UK. The NSA is using, now this is where it gets good, folks, is using computer-generated life forms from which they look like the they look like the classic gray alien. These are basically robots that the military creates for use in Project Mannequin abductions in this country. They are known as PLFs. PLF stands for Programmable Life Forms. The technology was given to the NSA in the Human ET treaties, which started back in the 1930s, end quote, having to do with, Hitler, and then later the Allies kind of took it over and then reestablished an agreement with President Eisenhower in 1954. Now, here's what's also interesting as well. The hybrid children are being experimented in within California. Why is that the case? Because, as we know, the shadow government has to comply with the front end of the way in which the government operates, basically meaning, folks, that if we take a look at what occurs within the United States on a state-by-state basis, there are different rules, laws, and regulations, which is why there are certain experiments that simply cannot occur within the US, which is why it's being done in China and what have you. But notice something about California. The Rand Corporation is largely centered. Whenever some of their findings have been quote-unquote leaked or declassified, it has to do with the laboratory or facility in California, not just Rand, but I know I keep bringing this up, but look at Project Carrot, for example, by the way, folks. Notice how that's in California too. And why is it that California, the state government, is quietly buying up large and larger amounts of land? And also, by the way, notice Gavin Newsom, politically, who's the governor of California, who, by the way, is, I think, Nancy Pelosi's nephew or something like this. See how they all keep it in the circle, by the way? But anyways, Gavin Newsom has a recall on the front end politically to have him removed as the governor. Almost 2 million signatures have been signed. Why is that? This was not done. I mean, I would say that some people want him out. Don't get me wrong. It's politics. That's the way life goes. Not everyone likes the person that's been put in there, whether it's governor, president, senator, you name it. But Gavin Newsom is opposing, by the way, he is opposing the actual purchasing and obtainment of more and more land that the government is claiming we need to use to reserve it, right? But which part of the government is claiming that? They won't tell you because it's an intelligence operation. You see the way they work here? There are unofficial apparatuses that tend to work with regards to the whispering of the way in which things go politically. Now, let's take a look here. Let's continue on. Project Mannequin was then started by the NSA in 1972 at the underground facility in Peasmore. The base has entrances at Aldermaston and Greenham Common. My first memories of my involvement with the project were of being escorted down the tunnels at the age of 5 by military personnel, end quote. This is according to bibliotecaplates.net, but this has to do with a gentleman who has recovered different memories from their secret space program time. Now, let's carry on. Let's take a look here because this is very interesting as well too. Big Tech, this is according to helenastales.weebly.com, not exactly a mainstream media website, folks. Big Tech pouring billions into harvesting blood of the young so elites can live and rule forever. Now, that sounds like a bit of a sensationalistic title, you name it. Now, here's the thing. The elites have been slowly purchasing parts of the land, which under the guise of Bill Gates, because he's the fall guy. He takes the hit, and then everyone else can benefit from it, right? Because he's just so powerful at this point, he doesn't even care about the reputation of his name. He purchases the land. The NSA uses it for some hybrid children programming that comes from Canadian dummy companies that then is associated with software within Europe that the Pentagon transferred their IP addresses to, which we'll get to in a second. And the elites are using these underground bases as a way of being able to prepare for the current Armageddon to come. Now, I know you might be saying, Dave, that's a little bit ridiculous. What do you mean by Armageddon to come and things like this? Well, I mean this right here. Let's take a look at sinhalanet.net. 3 corporations run the world: City of London, Washington, D.C., and Vatican City. Now, before I go on, when we say, for example, the Armageddon, it's not necessarily that the world is going to end, but rather there's going to be a reinstitution or I guess we could say a realignment of the way in which things are shifted generally. Right now, when we take a look at Project 5150, what we're going to find is that most of these children are being recruited to go to California, just like how, for example, and we talk more about this on Patreon, by the way, because there's only so much I could say publicly, But those that are going to California now, 20 years ago, the state used to be Ohio. And guess who was running that operation there? It was Epstein and Leslie Wexner. Now you might be saying, Dave, what does this have to do with extraterrestrials and aliens? Well, folks, I want to tell you this. The Zetas, the Greys, I know people are tired of hearing the Zetas, the Greys, the same old species, but we got to call it like it is, right? They are giving the United States government technology that can empower and control clones or beings of consciousness that do not have a soul, that then have the ability to use different forms of control, manipulation, intimidation, and other different things, which is why nowadays you will not see, folks, men in black showing up at people's doors as much. It still happens, but you can't send men in black to go scare someone who lives in the middle of the city anymore. There's too many cameras. There's too much upfront public technology. So what do? You literally abduct them. You start buying up more and more forests and national land, say that you're doing it for the environment when we really know that's a BS reason. Everybody knows that. And you start kidnapping these children and kidnapping any adults or journalists who look into it, which is the same thing that happened to a journalist who was told to look into this Pentagon story, who has now gone missing. And we'll get into more of that on Patreon because there's only so many things I could say publicly here right now. Let's carry on. Let's take a look at this article right here. CNN.com. McDonald's new BTS meal is coming, featuring flavors you weren't able to get in the US. Why is that the case? You want to know something that some of these McDonald's meat, and those on Patreon will know, is emitting frequentially? 5150. Why is it? And also, by the way, if you look at the metadata of the IP addresses that the Pentagon transferred, it was 5150 as well. So why is it, folks? This is what I really want to know. And this is, I think, what we all want to know. Why is it that 5150 seems to keep reoccurring? And also the numbers, not in any particular order, but the numbers 0, 5, and 1, whichever order you want to put it in, also seems to be that of a frequentially healing number. So I think, folks, what we're looking at here is we're looking at an esoteric aspect, a technological aspect, an extraterrestrial aspect. Sorry, just took a sip of water there. And we are looking at a human intelligence aspect. These numbers are not coincidental. Notice something having to do with every publicized CIA document as well. You will always find the numbers 5, 1, and 5 and 0. Doesn't have to be together, but they're scattered. But you will always find them there. Now, let's continue on because there's a lot more to look at here. Let's take a look. And this is according to Ars Technica. Pentagon explains odd transfer of 175 million IP addresses to obscure company. Something weird happened minutes before Trump left. US says it was security research. Bull crap. Now, folks, listen, we're going to get into this into the live stream later on tonight if you're watching this before the live stream. But, I mean, my God, the CIA, the Pentagon, their job is to lie, even to their own people. And I'm not saying this just about the US, but in general. So let's take a look. The US Department of Defense puzzled internet experts by apparently transferring control of tens of millions of dormant IP addresses to an obscure Florida company just before President Donald Trump left the White House. Now, end quote. Before we go on, we're not going to read into all this because the Pentagon's excuses and all that is BS, right? But here's what's interesting. The Florida dummy company is associated with a company in Norway and Denmark. Norway and Denmark generally house tall whites, Nordics, you name it, right? Now, here's what's interesting as well, too. Notice how the bases within England are perpendicular frequentially and geographically to what the dummy LLC numbered holding company in Europe is. And you can find that numbered company if you look into the Florida company, which is basically at this point a public LLC, global resource systems company, which is, again, so vague we don't even, like, what the hell does that mean? Global resource systems. You know what I mean? This is what they do. It's very traditional and basic. But the point here is this. They are expanding the cloning operation, and the subset, the second hub, the second base, if you will, is in California because the public law allows for them to get away with things much more easier. Now, you might be saying, Dave, how do you know this for sure? Well, let's take a look. FoxNews.com. This came out today, an hour before I was going to record this, folks. Houston police find more than 90 people in home after receiving kidnapping tips. Some have COVID symptoms, end quote. Now, if you take a look at some of the initial reports, the ones that allegedly had quote unquote COVID symptoms, and I'm not going to get into the COVID thing because I don't want the video to get removed, were whispering the words 5-1, 5-1, 5-1 while they were trembling and shaking. Is that a fluke? Is that honestly a fluke? I don't know, and it could be, but at the same time, there's no such thing as conspiracies, but there's no such thing as coincidences as well. We're seeing here, and by the way, the Houston police, and says here, uncovered dozens of people trapped in a home on Chessington Drive after responding to a reported kidnapping call. You want to know something about Chessington Drive, folks? About 75 years ago, it was allegedly a street that had an underground tunnel that connected all the way to California. I mean, what are the odds? Do you see what I'm saying here, folks? What are the odds? Now, let's take a look at something else here, too. This right here. Robologiclab.com. Zombie genes study reveals some genes come to life after death of the human brains. Now, interestingly enough, folks, take a look at Ghislaine Maxwell's recent photo with the black eye that just recently came out. That could be adrenochrome withdrawal having to do with these same zombie genes. Now, you might be saying, okay, Dave, how do you know it's these zombie genes? Well, the company that Dr. Jeffrey Loeb has been looking into, that is the head of the rehabilitation and neurology at St. John, at the John S. Garvin Professor at the UIC College of Medicine, he basically had a vested interest and had a quiet investment given to him by Jeffrey Epstein on behalf of Bill Gates. And we'll be getting into this on Patreon more because there's only so much I could say here. But do you see the connection here, folks? Do you see the way in which humans are basically saying to the extraterrestrials, yeah, we'll take whatever you give us, and then they exploit the living hell out of it? No wonder other species do not want to share more advanced and much more, I guess we could say, prime technologies with us, rather, because we would much rather go for the quick, easy way. You know what I mean? The government would rather much do that. Let's just grab whatever any race will give us, and then we'll take it from there, right? Like, I mean, take a look at the connections here. You can't make this stuff up. You just can't. This is one of those things that, I mean, you look at it and you go, my God, is this really legitimate, right? Now, the final thing that I want to take a look at here, too, is that if we examine the Project Mannequin transcript on bibliotecaplades.net, you're going to find here is that the NSA is controlling a lot of these grays that they are then making to abduct people in national forest to scare them. People who have gotten too spiritually enlightened. Now, some of you may turn off at this point in the episode and say, oh, what do you mean? Well, again, without giving too much away because of the fact that I have to be careful of what I say publicly, the energy you give off from an esoteric aspect in general, folks, is what the government fears the most. This is one of the things that they're trying to suppress us with through food, and those who are members on Patreon will see the different examples we've given, right, about how suppression is there, the whole aspect of depression and, you know, controlling the mind is all there. Why is that the case? Because take aliens away for a second. Look at every single CIA operation that has occurred, right? What happens when they're trying to make the perfect super soldier? Not like genetic experiments. I'm just talking about making like a CIA asset, a killer, an assassin, and have no emotion. They break them down first. They make them depressed. They give them anxiety. They waterboard them. They torture them. Kind of like resetting a computer. You see what I'm saying here? It's like resetting your mind. It's like rebooting a computer the way you could do it to a human. So why would this be any different? They're kidnapping the people and the children and the humans in California. They're shipping them out to Norway, Denmark, those places that the Nordics and the tall whites are then taking, and then the Pentagon, more specifically the NSA, at a super secretive level, is then using these beings to kidnap people around the world who are getting too close to finding the truth and communicating with beings from other galaxies in this dimension in an esoteric way. Now, you might be saying, Dave, are you referring to, the CE5 protocols? Look, folks, I honestly don't know it. That could be one of them. People have told me that the protocols work, but in general, that would be the idea. The NSA is trying to prevent people like you and I from summoning the UFO craft, from summoning a lot of these beings to us, because again, that is how we have direct access to the truth in many ways. But also, the NSA has created an energetic trap around the globe, and there's many different energetic fields around this planet, by the way, to basically have a UFO from NSA secret base in England respond to someone's esoteric and telepathic projection when it's put out there saying, I want to interact. So we could argue, for example, no disrespect to Stephen Greer, but we can argue that when Stephen Greer and his team summon different UFOs, it's actually controlled by the NSA, because you see the intermergence of the way that the suppression is happening here. So, I want you all to let me know what you think, and we'll catch you guys a little bit later on today for the members and tomorrow for another great episode. Cheers.